Hey guys, Colleen here, and on the bench today I have a Musicman amp. It's a 1977 model 2275-65. It's a 210 combo amp. We have tremolo, reverb, we have two channels. Musicman amps are really cool. They can be finicky, and some people don't love working on them because they are hybrid. The preamp section is solid state, and sometimes the driver is solid state, sometimes it's a 12AX7. In this case, we have a 12AX7 driver. And we have two 6CA7 output tubes. The repair today is going to be a refurbishing of both power supplies. This is going to be the high voltage power supply, also known as the B plus power supply. That's like the big filter caps that you're used to seeing. And then we're also going to be restoring the low voltage power supply. So this is feeding the low positive and negative voltage to the amp. Let's get this on the bench and I'll give you guys a closer look at the circuit. Like I said, I generally like to refurbish both the high voltage and low voltage power supply when it comes to Musicman amps. So here we have the low voltage power supply. I generally like to replace these two caps. They're 150 microfarad at 50 volts. You can see here that the circuit board looks a little dark. So when I have the board flipped over, I'll make sure that the traces look okay and aren't damaged from the heat. I'll also replace these two electrolytics, also 150 at 50, and then this one too. If there's an output tube failure, which isn't the case with this amp, I will rebuild the output circuit, and that includes replacing the affiliated components. So this is the high voltage power supply, and these are the main filter caps. You can see that these are really leaky. We have two 100 microfarad at 450 volt caps, and then two 20 microfarad. I'm going to use 22 microfarad at 500 volts. So let's go ahead and replace these. These dang old parrots. And onto the low voltage power supply caps. This one is part of the bias circuit. And now we'll lift this board to access these caps. These are the first two caps in the low voltage section. You know, Hank, I've got all these demos that I recorded years ago that I would love to upload, to share and stream. So I decided, why not try out DistroKid? As we know, DistroKid is a service that helps musicians upload their music to all major streaming platforms. Users of my channel get 30% off at the link I will post below. So go check it out, get those dusty old demos or your fresh, sparkly new tracks. Whatever it may be, get it uploaded. And now we'll remove the main board to access the rest of the low voltage supply. So I mentioned this burnt area earlier, and I wanted to check the traces on the other side, and they actually look fine in this case. I'm going to go ahead and replace these components regardless, but if the traces were lifting up, I'd have to hardwire them. But I think in this case, a parts replacement and resolder will hold up just fine. It can be a bit tricky to work on these boards. You want to make sure you're not going to break a wire by bending the board too far back. Watch your heat to avoid damaging the traces, stuff like that. Also, it's important to note the polarity of the caps as you replace them. Sometimes I'll mark a black dot with a Sharpie at the negative side just to make sure that the orientations are all correct. We're going to replace these two 620 ohm 5-watt resistors. We're also going to replace these two 1N4745 diodes. This section that we've been addressing here supplies the final plus and minus 16 volts to the amp. Primarily, the solid state preamp uses the low plus and minus voltages to power like the ICs and stuff. We can actually see that this trace is starting to lift a little bit, which is fairly normal on the side of the board due to the heat that is happening. So I'm going to go ahead and hardwire this trace just by running a wire from one end to the other. And I'll always give it a little wiggle to make sure that there's no trace movement happening. And lastly, we are going to replace these two diodes. It's important to note the direction of the cathode, which is indicated by the stripe on the diode. One more time, I'm just going to make sure there's no trace movement happening. I always like to make sure I resolder any of the problem areas on this board, specifically like the bias pot and any of the other heavier components. Just go through and resolder all that stuff. All right, so lastly, we're going to set the bias. And Musicman amps have a unique way of setting the bias for the output tubes. There are two different ways depending on whether the amp has a tube or a solid state driver. So in this case, since we have a 12AX7, we're going to refer to the grid bias calibration section of this service bulletin. We'll clip one end of our meter to ground, and then the other end of the meter clips to the cathode of one of the output tubes, which is pin 8. We're looking at 0.713 volts DC here, and we're looking for 0.5 volts. So we're going to go here to the bias calibration pot and turn it down until we get as close to 0.5 volts as we can. And I must not forget to remove the death cap. So here's a little snippet from the 1977 Musicman catalog. We can see that a lot of amazing artists played Musicman amps around this time. But I wanted to feature a little bit of Eric Clapton.